Hi everyone, we're now moving into the last little stretch of the program, and this is the area where I guess all your hard work gets to pay off, and hopefully you'll begin to appreciate the importance of getting those planning stages done early, so that when you do come into that last run towards the submission date, you'll find that you have a strong foundation to build on. It's also a time where we're talking about feedback, and it's for various reasons. The workshop activity for this week is providing a peer with feedback, and as I think the study guide makes clear, there's a whole series of advantages to this. Not only that it's a little mini deadline for you to have something ready to go, you also have the advantage of someone giving you feedback on your project and getting a different opinion. But the most important thing is really giving you the opportunity to provide feedback, which is honestly the best way to learn about writing, is to look at really seriously at someone else's writing, not just in a kind of, oh, it looks okay to me sort of way, not in terms of proofreading, but engaging with it in the same way that you have been this term, and thinking about all those issues about structure and argument and evidence and all those things that go into a piece of legal research. So there's lots of benefits out of this project. It's one that I've used for 20 years or so now, and students generally find it extremely helpful. And it's one of those things that you don't often think about from the other side. You write assignments, you hand them in, and you get them marked, but you never really think about the process that goes into examining a piece of written work seriously and thinking about it. And I think that's very, very beneficial. And I know myself, I only really started to understand writing when I started marking, which was possibly a bit late given I was doing my master's by that point and I already had my bachelor's degree. But it was amazing how quickly, when you're doing I had a few days to mark about 200 criminal law assignments, but suddenly things started clicking for me in a way that they hadn't before. So it's a good exercise. Also, I think this is a good week and a good time to start talking seriously about feedback, because feedback is a very important process, not just in your study, but in life generally. And there's a whole set of complex skills that are tied into both giving feedback, but also in receiving feedback, that are very important. And people who are successful are often people who not only are good at giving others feedback, those are successful managers, and honestly, there aren't that many out there that are good at giving feedback. But also people who are successful in themselves are people who are good at using feedback and using it appropriately. Because the big thing that gets in our way when using feedback is us. It's ego. And it's a perfectly normal human trait to not like to be criticised, to feel defensive when you're being criticised, and to sort of go on the attack when you're being criticised, and to go, well, what would they know? They don't understand. They're just stupid. And it's a way of shielding yourself. It's a way of protecting your ego from the feeling that's not a very nice feeling, that you may not have done the best you can and that you can improve. However, people who are successful get over themselves, and they, maybe the person giving the feedback was wrong. Maybe the person who's giving the feedback doesn't understand everything. No one understands everything. But they have given you some feedback. They've taken the time out. They've provided you with some feedback. So take that for what it is. Most people giving feedback are doing so in an honest way, even if they're not good at giving feedback, even if they're not always good at picking the right words to use, or they say things that you find provocative, or you find you have a defensive reaction to. Take it for what it is. Take it for someone sincerely giving you feedback, and say, okay, putting my ego aside for a moment, and yeah, my ego might be bruised a bit, but what is it they actually have to say, and what can I learn from? And I think the people who do that are very successful. So, if successful athletes, for instance, every time a coach told them that they were, doing something a little bit wrong in what they were doing, if they stormed off and had a tantrum and said, what do they know? I don't agree with them, whatever, they would never improve. They'd never be successful athletes. And it's the same for any field. Successful artists, successful writers, successful anyone's are not people that are born with inherent talent necessarily. They have some talent, but they're people who are capable of acting on feedback. So there's lots of things to think about this week, and there's a lot of things to think about in the grand scheme of things, because I think it is very easy to become very passive as a student, and it's very easy to see the whole administration of the university as a big monolith, to put your assessment in, and then when it comes back and you don't get the mark you want, to go, well, that's just because they're stupid, or they didn't teach me well enough, or they didn't give me enough instructions, or this I didn't understand what I needed to do, and it was their fault because they didn't explain it, and all these kind of things. And again, as I said at the start, those are things that our ego produces quite naturally in response to feeling threatened. And usually when that happens, and usually the strength of that is because we know we didn't do absolutely our best. None of us do. There's all things that we can learn, and we all hand in assignments without putting in the work we need to. The university has that assumption that we're doing 10 to 12 hours per subject per week. I'm guessing not everyone is reaching those 10 to 12 hours. So again, there's something in your brain that says, well, I didn't really do my 12 hours every week for this subject, therefore it's the lecturer's fault, or it's the marker's fault, or in this case it's the peer student who's giving me feedback that's at fault. So part of the process of being mature and being someone who masters some of those adulting skills is to be able to work with feedback. Which is not to say that lets the person giving the feedback entirely off the hook. And again, we can all learn how to give feedback in a better way. You'll all probably end up managing people in a professional role somewhere in your life, and that is an extremely hard thing to do. Particularly because the person you're giving feedback to is often very defensive. They are often hurt by the things you say, even if they're entirely deserved, and often especially because they're entirely deserved. And there is a whole set of skills and I think calluses that you have to be able to provide, or maybe resilience is probably the better term, where you can say, this is a difficult process. I know this person doesn't want to hear the things I have to say, but I need to be able to tell them these things, and this is what they need to know to improve. So this is one of those really big issues that when you start taking the surface off, it becomes very, very complicated. Not because the actual process of giving feedback is complicated in any ways, but because the skills underneath it. And I think the only way to really improve is through practice. So practice in giving feedback, and practice in being very conscious in the way in which you receive feedback, and not going, well, I didn't get the mark I liked, I'm going to go and write a really nasty have you say comment in response to that, because it's the inner child thing. I'll have a little tantrum because I feel really hurt about this. Instead of thinking about it and going, okay, well, what if that feedback is credible? What is the things that I don't want to hear that they've told me? And if I don't agree with them, how do I engage with that feedback in a mature way and say, this is I didn't get what I needed from this particular subject or from this particular piece of feedback. This is what I need. Tell me to tell the person what feedback you need from them rather than the feedback they gave. Because sometimes there's a lot of assumptions here. A lot of people assume the sort of feedback that you need is not necessarily the thing you really needed some feedback on. Anyway, it's all more art than science, and as I said, the more practice you have, the better. This is an opportunity to have a bit of a practice with a peer in a non-threatening environment. There's 3 marks for it in your portfolio, so it's not like there's a lot. You're not going to be graded on the feedback that you gave. If you give a reasonable amount of feedback, you'll get your 3 marks. One point on that's important that I should note is if you're giving your peer feedback as comments on their paper, don't put their entire paper into your portfolio, because not only will your portfolio then end up very, very long, but then that will, when your peer puts their assignment in through Turnitin, it will say it's already been submitted because you've put that version of their assignment in your portfolio. So just put in a summary, and as I said, like most weeks, it's like a half page, a summary of the feedback that you gave to your peer. That's plenty. You don't have to cut and paste the entire assignment in, and in fact, if you do that, then that's going to create a little bit of trouble later on when that poor person comes back with like a 90% turn it in score at the end of the day. What else do I have to talk about today? The feedback and proofreading are two separate things. Don't feel like you're spell checking, and especially because you're getting a very early draft of the final paper, it isn't necessarily all that useful to point out grammatical mistakes because it's generally pretty rough. And the other thing is proofreading and academic feedback are two entirely different skill sets and are two entirely different processes. So don't feel the obligation or get into there and say you should have used that word here and this word there. Sure, if it's something you think that's glaring, you can point it out, that's not a problem. But the purpose here is not to pick up typos. The purpose here is really to think about things like structure and argument. You know, does it make an argument? Is it backed up with evidence? There's more stuff in the workbooks that'll explain all of this. Whatever else. Is a draft, it's going to be incomplete, accept that. When you're writing your draft, make sure you put linking statements in where you've got gaps. And I've mentioned this a few times before, but just to mention it again, you know, just put some square brackets in and say, I haven't finished this section, I'm finalising my research on this case now, and I'll put an analysis of the case here. And just flag that for the person reading so they know the sort of thing that you'll be putting in there, and that gives them an opportunity to go, well, you know, that sounds good, or no, I don't think that's really necessary, don't do that extra work, or whatever else. And it's also, I think, part of that process of getting used to the feedback and writing process being a communicative process. And again, it's part of that structure of the sort of bad habits that universities and education instills, where it's like, well, hand me in the final thing and I'll give you some comments on it when it's too late. And that is not the way anything works in the real world by a long stretch. But we get so used to, in educational context, this idea that the whole process of feedback is I finish something and you give me feedback on the finished thing. And at which point it's like, well, if I'm going to do that thing again, I'll take that feedback into account, but it's not really useful at that point. So even when you're working with someone on a draft, don't get into that mindset of this being like the final end thing. Think about how you can actually approach that feedback, both from the person who's the writer and the person who's giving the feedback, as a work in progress, and that's much more useful. All right. Now, in terms of finding a partner for the feedback process, there's a forum on Moodle for you to find someone to connect with. Otherwise, come along to the workshop next week and I'll say who needs a partner, and I'll just sort of put people together that way. That's another way to do it. All right, what's anything else to talk about this week? I suppose the other thing in terms of feedback is that the Have Your Say surveys are open. Now, in terms of feedback, honestly, the best form of feedback is talking to me, and that's generally the most useful way to get feedback anywhere along the line. And I've done that a few times this term where people have said, we need more resources on this or that, and I've provided some extra resources. That's generally the best way to give feedback to any kind of educational environment. And that's the leaf blower next door. I hope that's not too annoying to you. It's pretty annoying to me. So yeah, in terms of the how do you give me feedback on the course, the easiest way is to send me an email or to book a consult time or whatever and have a chat about things. And that's honestly the best way to do things. The Have Your Say surveys there are presuming this idea that as a student, you know, you're going to be too scared to approach lecturers and talk to them, and, you know, whatever. They're not, the actual surveys themselves aren't great, and unfortunately they don't ask very useful questions. So they basically ask things like, did you like the course? Was it taught the correct way? And they're things that student feedback's, you know, not directly all that useful for in course review. And other universities have moved to other models where they talk about what the students need and what a student needs in terms of their learning. So think about that when you're doing the Have Your Say surveys, that yeah, you can say, do you rate this course between 1 and 10 or whatever? Do you like the lecturer or not? Which is the way the questions are sort of written. But what's actually more useful in feedback is saying, I have need for more skills in this particular area. Can you put more of this in the course, or find some way to provide this elsewhere in the program? So, for instance, I've realised through teaching this term, a lot of people are not really familiar with using the library databases. And that's good, and we're going to add more information into the other earlier subjects so that you have that information earlier. And that's really useful feedback. Whether you liked legal research or not all that useful, because you've got to do it. And it is what it is. There's not a whole lot of ways we can change what legal research is. But being able to say, this is a skill I need to have. I feel as though I'm weak in this area. I need more support in that area. Thinking about what it is technically that you need is actually more useful for us to act on. And I think in that way, the whole Have Your Say activity is a very interesting example of what we're talking about this week in terms of feedback. And it's a pretty crude feedback tool, and it's basically sort of a put your note in the box customer evaluation kind of thing that you would do at McDonald's or a supermarket. And it's not very nuanced, and I've been suggesting the uni moves towards another model, but we'll see how they go with that. But as I said at the start of this little ramble, by far the most effective way of giving feedback is to actually talk to me, send me an email, make a time to have a chat if you want to, and to talk about those things, and to say things like, I'm feeling like I really don't understand precedent even though I've done 2 years of it. Can you give me some pointers? Is there some extra things that we can do? And that's a much more useful way of doing things. However, if you're in the situation where you just don't like the mark that you've got, and your child's feeling hurt and you want to have a bit of a rant, then join the club, because that's what a lot of the feedback actually ends up being at the end of the day. But I'm hoping as legal professionals we can actually aspire to be better at feedback and better at giving and receiving it. Alright, so what else is in the course book this week? There's a reading from the Victoria Law Foundation, the Better Information Handbook. It's quite long, I don't expect you to read it all now, but to have a skim through it, because it has lots of really good tips about preparing legal information, not just in terms of reports, but also in terms of communicating with clients. And it's a really useful thing to keep for the future, and to keep for future assignments, to keep for future work. If you're going to be doing honours, you'll be looking at it again in terms of writing your honours dissertation. It's also good because it engages with that idea of communication in a very direct way. So it's not like a set of minimum standards and it says you've got to use these words and that words, or a style guide or anything like that. It actually thinks about what is the role of professional communication and what those skills involve. So it's a good read. Like I said, I don't expect people to have an encyclopedic knowledge at week 11 of the course when everything's due in, but have a skim through it, have a look at the kinds of things it talks about, and file it away for future reference. The equilibrium section this week, we're looking again at this concept of feedback, being effective about feedback, and all about building resilience. And that's a lifelong activity. Even when you're in your late 40s, you still don't like people criticising you. You still don't like, whether it be your supervisor at work, or your martial arts instructor, or someone who you're preparing a piece of artwork for, or any of those things. No one actually enjoys having people say, you can do better. But the people, as I said, who are successful are those who are resilient in themselves, and who don't let that hurt in a child deprive them of the opportunity to think and learn about things. The Navigating the Law section this week in the study guides is about different forms of primary research. It doesn't really fit here, honestly, but we had to fit it in somewhere. And it's really stuff to file away and think about for the future. So it's all those primary things like surveys, interviews, ethnography, case studies. And this is just a little note for those of you who are thinking about doing honours, about thinking about, well, what sort of projects might I do in the legal field that involve these methodologies? How can I find out more about something that I can't get from a law report or from a government report? How are some of these primary forms of research? So yeah, at the moment you've probably got lots of deadlines and lots of pressures and lots of other things to focus on. But I think it's important to take a little bit of a breather and to also can think about the future and to think about things like honours, things about future study, to think, do you want to do a PhD one day? Do you want to be able to call yourself a doctor? Sometimes a useful thing to have. So moving into the last part of the course, yes, we're going to you're all going to be focusing on getting that last bit of the work done, but it's also important we take a little bit of time to start to think about some of those bigger issues of where you are or where you're going, because now's the time to start planning, and now's the time to start thinking about what you need to be able to get from where you are now to where you want to go.